Howdy folks, and welcome to the Hillbilly Kitchen. Today we're making poor man's cake. This is a really old recipe. It's a delicious cake and it is fairly simple, has simple ingredients, and it's missing some things. If you look here at our ingredients, you will see there is no milk, no eggs, and no butter. All things you normally find in a cake. Well, this recipe originated in the late 20s, early 30s, and was popular all the way up through the 40s because those things were very hard to come by all through that period of our past, especially the 30s and 40s when rations happened. You could not get those things. It also started because a lot of the ingredients that are in this cake were passed out in food boxes during the 30s after the Dust Bowl, when our country was going through a very, very tough economic time and people were really struggling just to survive. Probably way worse than what we're going through right now, and I know that a lot of you are having a hard time, but if you look back at that period in time and you see how our grandmothers, and for some of you, your great-grandparents got through this, I think you will see that maybe things aren't so bad right now, and maybe you can draw some hope from their stories. So take some time and look up some of those stories. If you're not old enough to remember the stories that your grandmothers told, look some of those up, because there's a lot of those online and there's a lot of hope to be found in their stories. Anyway, let's get on with this recipe. I have 1.5 cups of plain flour. You don't really want self-rising flour in this, and I haven't tried it with self-rising flour, so I'm not sure what it would do, because the way you cook it, it's a little bit different. So 1.5 cups of plain flour, 1 cup of water, and I do always use filtered water in recipes like this because the water is such a part of it. I don't want that chlorine in what I'm baking. I think the chemicals affect the way your final result. Maybe not a lot, but they do some. I have about 1.5 cups of raisins. This is 1/2 of a 14 or 16 ounce package. And I have 1/2 teaspoon each of salt, cinnamon, and cloves. You can also add ginger and nutmeg to this if you wanted to. You could add allspice to it. You could even use pumpkin pie spice if you don't have these spices. And I have a tablespoon of vegetable shortening. And if you've watched my videos before, you know I don't use it a lot, but that's what the original recipe called for, and I kind of wanted to keep this recipe authentic. You could substitute something like coconut oil or even butter for it, but like I said, during the period where this recipe comes from, butter was rationed. It was one of the things you didn't have unless you had a cow to make your own butter. And I have 1/2 cup of brown sugar. Or I'm sorry, 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 cup of brown sugar. You can substitute regular sugar in this recipe. Brown sugar is a combination of molasses and regular white sugar. And I think that during the period of time where this recipe came from, that a lot of folks probably used molasses to sweeten it with and they didn't have any sugar. Or maybe they would use sorghum or even maple syrup or honey to sweeten this cake, because sugar was one of those things that was really, really scarce and it was rationed and you just could not get it. But the recipe now calls for 1 cup of brown sugar. And I have 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, and I've got a tablespoon of water over here. And I'm going to show you what we're going to do with this. This is kind of the secret to the cake here. Let me move my cake. This is not like a typical box cake. You're not going to get a store-bought box cake out of this recipe. It's similar to maybe a banana bread in texture, but not quite. It's actually a little bit chewy, which I like, probably because, well, it doesn't have any milk in it. It doesn't have any eggs in it. You know, that's going to affect the texture. But it's delicious, and you could bake it and top it different ways. I have some cream cheese frosting on it here, and I will link the recipe to my cream cheese frosting in the description of this video down below here. It's really, really easy to make. The cake is usually topped with cream cheese frosting now. Back then it would have had nothing on it, or it would have been topped with just a little powdered sugar, and we'll get into that in a minute. But how you want to start is you want to put all this stuff here, your water, your raisins, your spices, your shortening, and your sugar in a pot and boil it. So I'm just going to dump all this in there. The water and the raisins. Careful, don't splash it everywhere. If you're not a fan of raisins, you can substitute cranberries in this, or maybe even some other dried fruit. Go ahead and add your spices and your shortening and your sugar. You can also add nuts to this. If you add nuts to it though, you want to wait until you add the flour. You don't want to put them in here and boil them. That wouldn't be good. But you could use pecans or walnuts or even peanuts in this. You don't need to like stir this constantly or watch it real close while it's boiling. You just want to make sure it doesn't boil over, and you do want to stir it up because you want to get your spices dissolved in there, and you want to get the sugar, make sure it's all dissolved and not lumped up, which the heat should take care of it, and get your shortening distributed. And like I said, if you don't want to use the vegetable shortening, you could use coconut oil or butter or something like that. And we're going to bake this in an 8x8 dish. You can double this recipe and do it in a 9x13 pan. This is not really a cake you want to layer. You could bake it in muffin pan, you know, do it in a muffin tin and do it in muffin cups. I think this would make excellent muffins. And I'm going to do some muffins. I'll post pictures in the video so you can see what it looks like as a muffin. And I'm also going to try this today with cranberries and pecans in it. And I'm going to try it with some chopped peanuts in with the raisins. So I'm going to do a few varieties of it today. I'll post pictures of all of it and give you the options in the ingredient list in the description. Do want to grease your pan, and I just wiped a little of my shortening in the pan. You could spray it with nonstick spray too if you wanted to. Just up to you. Like I said, this recipe comes from a time where we can kind of draw some hope from it. It was created out of necessity because there were severe food shortages, probably even more so than what we experienced this spring. And the recipe is really good if you have older dried fruit, like if your raisins have been in the cabinet for a while and maybe you bought them to put back and you let them stay put back a little bit too long and they've started to get sugar crystals on them and dried a little bit. This recipe is great for that because you're going to sit here and boil them and let them soak, so they'll plump right back up. And that was one of the things that my grandmothers both talked about doing. They used everything. Nothing was thrown out. Even if it was something that maybe was a little past its prime, they would still use it, and they were grateful to get it because there were so many shortages during that time. And my grandmothers had very different stories. My mom's mom, she was poor, grew up in the country, farmed to feed her family. They survived mostly off of their farm. They would sell some animals and they would sell some of their vegetable crop. Maybe if they slaughtered some animals in the fall, they would sell half of them and keep half of them. And their crops, they would sell part of them and keep part. And I said that I think a lot of people probably sweetened this with sorghum during that time, or molasses, because they would actually make that. That wasn't something that they had to buy with ration tickets or with money because they didn't have it. And I remember as a very small child, my grandpa, he grew cane sugar, or sugar cane, and he would take it to the mill and they would press it and boil it down and make molasses out of it. And my granny used it in a lot of stuff. Different flavor, but it's still sweet. And my dad's mom, she lived in New Jersey, and she was a city girl. And my grandfather was drafted during the mid-40s and left her to take care of 2 babies. The oldest one was 2 and the younger one was an infant while he was gone. And she really had a struggle because she didn't have a big family farm around her to feed her children off of. So like I said, their stories were very different, but they survived it and they did different things to get through it. Okay, this is boiling, so I'm going to turn this off. And what you do with this is you let it sit here. You let it sit until it cools to room temperature. And that's going to take, you know, depending on how long or how hot it is or how drafty it is, 20-30 minutes maybe a little bit longer. But if you're in a hurry, you can let it, you know, just cool down till it's lukewarm. Or if you've got plenty of time, you can let it sit there for hours and let that fruit soak in the water and the syrup. So it's just kind of up to you how long you let it sit there. You can go anywhere from 15-20 minutes to half a day or longer. And once it sits there and it's cooled down, it's going to turn into a nice, thick, dark syrup. I mean, you can see how dark that is. The raisins are all plumped up now. And that's what you want. Now, what we're going to do with our water and our baking soda is we're going to heat this water up and get it hot, because you want your tablespoon of water hot. Okay, this is really hot. Now, this is part of what makes this cake work. We're going to mix our ½ teaspoon of baking soda into our tablespoon of hot water. And watch what happens. See how it fizzes up? And you want to dissolve it, look at that, in your hot water. That changes the texture of the cake. You don't want to skip that. Now, if this is still hot, if you've only let it cool like 15 or 20 minutes, you can go ahead and dump your baking soda in here. And you can see it's still bubbling just a little bit. That's what you want. Now, I do recommend sifting your flour to put it in this recipe, because it doesn't have any eggs and it doesn't have any milk, and it's gonna help with the texture. It will be much more dense if you don't sift your flour. So I'm just gonna add my 1.5 cups of flour and sift it with my little strainer here. One of these days I'm gonna have to break down and order a regular sifter, I guess. But what sifting does, it gets the lumps out of your flour, but more than getting the lumps out of your flour, it adds a whole lot of air into it, which is going to add air into your cake and make it a little lighter. And I'm going to add my baking soda and my water here. And just stir this up. You don't need a mixer and all that stuff for this. No need to get out the stand mixer and dirty up the stand mixer bowl. You can see that baking soda in there, or maybe you can. It's fizzing and bubbling as I'm stirring this. And it's super active because you mixed it with the hot water. Okay, that's good there. And we're just going to dump it in our greased pan. Kind of spread it out a little bit, and you can see the batter is about the consistency of muffin batter. It's a little thick. It's not like cake batter. Cake batter is much more pourable than this is. You're going to put this in a preheated 350-degree oven for anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes. If you do a double batch and you do it in a 9x13 pan, you're going to want at least 30 minutes, maybe even just a tiny bit longer. If your oven gets super, super hot, you might want to turn it down to 325. But bake it at 350, unless you have a really, really hot oven, and I know ovens do vary, for about 25 minutes. In 25-30 minutes, your cake is going to come out of the oven and it's going to look like this. It's going to be nice and golden brown. It should be firm, and you should be able to toothpick test it. And it does have a little bit of bounce to it, you know, like a regular cake or a muffin or something that has eggs and buttered milk and all that stuff in it. But like I said, it's a very different texture and it's a different taste. And if you're looking for something different that you can make with pantry ingredients, this is certainly it. And if you have those people with dairy allergies, this is definitely it, because there's no dairy in this. So this cake is perfect for all those folks with dairy allergies. Now, back when, like I said, this recipe came from that period of time when there were so many shortages, if it was topped with anything at all, it would have just had a little powdered sugar sprinkled on top of it. Unless maybe it was somebody's birthday or something, they might have splurged and made a buttercream frosting if they could get some butter, or a cream cheese frosting like what I have over here. Looks like this. And modern, if it's made now, it's generally topped with the cream cheese frosting, and I'll link, like I said, that video in the description so you can see how to make that if you don't know. But it's just cream cheese, butter, vanilla, and sugar. That's all it's in it. It's so simple. You just mix it up. Super easy, just like this cake. It's very simple. It's very forgiving. There's a lot of varieties you can do with it. If you're not crazy about the raisins, use some cranberries in it. You can add nuts to it to get a different texture and a totally different taste. You can put more spices in it, kind of heat it up a little bit. For me, the cinnamon and the cloves is plenty. I don't need any more spices in it than that. But if you want more, certainly put more in there. And you can keep it simple with some powdered sugar like this, or you can mix up the cream cheese frosting and put that on it. But like I said, this cake comes from a time that if we look back at that period, at what our grandmothers went through, and they survived it. And after that period, our nation and the whole world literally boomed. They called it the greatest generation because they rebuilt the country after that horrible, desperate period of time. And everything grew and everybody prospered. It was just a wonderful period. So if you need hope, look back at the past and read your Bible. Look at how things changed in the Bible. There were always cycles. There was always periods where people were desperate, where God's people were disobedient. They were out of His favor. They went through famines. They went through enslavements. But He always brought them through it, and He always brought them back to prominence. And the same thing is true if you look at more modern times. Like I said, the period that our grandparents went through, and from the 1930s to the 1950s, or the late 40s anyway, that period in there between the 1930 and like 1945. Look at that period and look at how they came through it, and look at what happened after that. And continue to pray and have faith, and pray for our nation, pray for each other, check on each other. Look back at some of these older recipes and maybe find some treats. I mean, there's nothing that'll help you get through a tough time like something that tastes good. Food is truly, they don't call it comfort food for no reason. It is comforting in hard times. So check out some of these older recipes like this. This is really good. I made it the other day. I hadn't made it in a long time, and Brett asked me if I had done a video on it, and I said no, and he said, well, you definitely need to. And you know, not just because it's a good recipe, because it's pretty inexpensive to make, because it is a pantry friendly recipe, and it is a recipe for the times that we're going through. And before we go, I want to leave you with Romans 15:13. Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope through the power of the Holy Ghost. My brothers and sisters, if we should abound in hope through the power of the Holy Ghost, He is in us. Don't lose your hope. If your hope is in Jesus Christ, then you should be full of joy and peace. And show that to the world. Share that with the world, and share a piece of poor man's cake with them. Because even in tough times, we can find joy, we can find peace, and we can have a piece of cake. Thank y'all so much for joining us in the Hillbilly Kitchen. If you have not already, please don't forget to click like and subscribe before you leave. And until next time, remember to put God first.